Airing first on Asheville FM, 103.3 WSFM LP in Asheville, North Carolina, this is The Final Straw Radio, a weekly anarchist and anti-authoritarian podcast and broadcast emanating from occupied Saligay land in southern Appalachia. We bring you voices from the long struggle towards liberation from around the world. Welcome. This week on the show, I'm speaking with three folks engaged in organizing in Alamance County, North Carolina, and its capital, Graham. All three work with the 501c4 political nonprofit DownhomeNC, which in Alamance has been working on a range of engagements, including running local candidates for office, doing get-out-the-vote work, sparking conversations with rural residents of the county, running a bail fund, and working on bail reform, rent relief, and operating food distribution. Dreama Caldwell, one of the guests, ran on a platform of bail reform to be the first Black woman elected to the county commission, though she did not win the election. She is also a mother and an abolitionist that has been working to abolish cash bail and change the condition for people of color and poor folks as relates to Alamance courts and jails. Sugalema, or Shug, is an organizer, a mom, and a daughter of undocumented parents from Mexico who's been living in Alamance for the last decade. Gwen is a mother from a white working-class background who has also worked to support Alamance organizers through DownhomeNC on a number of different campaigns. You can learn more about the organization at DownhomeNC.org and their various social media pages. As a side note, the folks who produce The Final Straw do not endorse electoralism as a strategy for lasting change or community power. We're anarchists, and there are plenty of places you can go to find anarchist critiques of engaging in electoral politics, sometimes with anarchists and anti-authoritarians advocating limited engagement in elections, but usually calling for abstention. Even though DownhomeNC is not an anarchist organization, we do feel like the experiences of Sugalema, Dreama, and Gwen are important to share because they talk about the work of changing minds and building relationships in the rural South where an autonomous left or anarchist movement doesn't exist, like most of the world. They are intelligent and impassioned women doing hard work to grow community resistance and engagement. Abolition also includes the complicated work of decreasing the harm caused by the systems of oppression like the police, courts, borders, white supremacy, and capitalism, while simultaneously building resistance to those institutions that impose harm. We really hope that the listeners will get a lot from this conversation. I know I did. And now a couple of announcements. In our show notes, you'll find a request for letters of support to Parole Zanochli, a long-standing Chicano-Mexicano organizer and anarchist communist being held in Texas, who is imprisoned for disarming a deputy sheriff, having so far served 24 years of a 50-year sentence. You can read more about him at prisonersolidarity.com. Anarchist and anti-fascist prisoner Eric King caught COVID at FCI Inglewood alongside over 100 other prisoners thanks to the ineptitude of his captors at the BOP who have been moving staff between Inglewood and FCI Florence, where an outbreak has been ongoing. His trial for defending himself from an attack by a prison officer has been pushed back until April 2021. In good news, though, his mail ban appears temporarily lifted and his website hosts his book list again. He's been able to receive letters, magazines, and books for the first time in years and is very happy about it. Check out the update at supportericking.org and send Eric some love. The Final Straw is a proud member of the Channel Zero network of anarchist podcasts. And here's a jingle from another member of CZN.
Hey everybody, my name's Eamon, and I'm the host of a show on the Channel Zero network called Radical People. And wouldn't you know it, we're going into the third season. It's a monthly show, so it's really not hard to get extra seasons. But anyway, basically, it's a show in which I interview people who are involved in direct action or direct action campaigns, past or present, and we hear their great stories. Anyway, it's on the Channel Zero network, it's on iTunes, and I'm sure at this point you know how to find a podcast. Radical People. Check it out.
I'm Gwen, and I am actually located in Guilford County, and I work with Down Home, and I use she, her pronouns.
My name is Dreama Caldwell, and I am an organizer with Down Home at the Alamance County chapter, and I also use she and her pronouns. And just a little bit about me, I just closed out running a county commissioner race here in Alamance.
Hi, my name is Sugalema. I go by Shug. My pronouns are she, her. I'm also an organizer here in Alamance County, and I'm a mom, so that's the biggest reason why I'm here is to make a better community.
Would you all be willing to set the stage and tell the listeners a bit about what we might need to know about Alamance County and its seat, Graham?
All right, I think I'll start. I am a native here in Alamance County, been here my whole life. Alamance County is located kind of central to North Carolina, right off of 85. We're in between Orange County, which is Hillsborough and Durham, and Guilford County, which is Greensboro. And Alamance County is known. Traditionally, it was a textile industry town. That is primarily how most of the people made their money in the town. And then some big known kind of industries is Burlington Industries. But some things began to close, textiles began to go away. And so as a result of that, poverty increased in our area. So it is an area that definitely has an elite population, but has a larger poverty population. Alamance County is a place to still disagreements over Confederate statue. And it has kind of been the focal point of issues that have kind of come to the forefront here. We have a large growing community that wants to work together, that are committed to anti-racist education and racial equity work. But then there's this other group that are primarily from Alamance County that have stayed here generationally. And the generational hate may have been passed down. So there is a growing Confederate community here too as well, that statue is like a lightning rod to them. It's like beholding them a lot and caused a lot of the conflict that has been going on.
So I've lived in Alamance County for about 9 years. I was living in the San Diego area before I moved here. So for me, it was a really big change with especially diversity. Like I'm Mexican American, so I was used to living in California, seeing people that look like me everywhere, and it never really seemed like a big deal. Moving here, it felt very. I mean, you could tell that there was a clear division amongst race. I'll just say it like that. And I think that initially, when I first moved here, I didn't want to go anywhere. It didn't seem like an inviting environment. But again, after probably a good 4 years, I started getting out, meeting new people. And for me, Alamance County has been like this place where I've met a lot of good people that are ready to change like the dynamics of Alamance County. So in one hand, I've had a kind of a crappy experience per se, because I felt very different in this environment. On the other hand, it's been wonderful meeting, such a diverse group of people that are willing to come together and work together.
Yeah, and I'll jump in as somebody who doesn't live in Alamance County. And, one of the things that Down Home does is we organize specifically in rural spaces in North Carolina, and we organize in rural spaces that have white supremacist organizing happening in them, and that's on purpose. I think that what we've seen, and Alamance is a really good example of this, is that so many southern rural spaces, and probably rural spaces across the nation, though I'm not as familiar, have really been abandoned in a lot of ways by sort of the traditional left. And so what happens is that if there's a lack of sort of like infrastructure and spaces for organizing, what we've seen is that these spaces are left to sort of the far right. And that's exactly what we see in Alamance County with the rise of local neo-Confederate groups and groups that have been listed as hate groups. And we see that Alamance isn't the only place we see that, of course, in North Carolina. But of course, it has this history of anti-racist organizing that dates all the way back to Reconstruction. And that has been even multiracial anti-racist organizing. But that's really been pushed to the side because of sort of common narratives around what rural or changing spaces, non-urban spaces look like in the South. And they are really even by like leftist journalists, are often characterized as the sort of the bastions of hate and of sort of backwardness, and only white folks. But of course, Alamance County is barely a white county. There is and has always been multiracial coalitions, and there is and always has been large Black populations, and there's a huge growing Latinx population, of course, there. So a lot of our interest and work in Alamance County is just really reframing and reclaiming what these spaces look like. And I think that's sort of, there's this old South, new South crux that's happening in Alamance County, and the power dynamics there make it really clear.
It seems like the work that y'all are doing, not only on the ground, but also in working to change these narratives, like without that opportunity that it's complex, there's not room for people to think that work can happen and that relationships can be melded into something stronger and that change can occur.
It takes me back to the deep canvassing project that we did before COVID hit, and being out there in the rural spaces, having to talk to people, driving down these long driveways, not knowing who I'm going to encounter, and then, talking to someone and just being able to connect with someone for, 30 minutes on their doorstep, just taking the time to hold the space, to listen to their stories and trying to connect with them. I think that's been a very powerful thing for me as a part of Down Home, is just realizing that we can connect, that bringing back just the humanity of each other and who we really are in our hearts, and not so much what's happening out in the news. I don't know if that makes any sense. It's just like, I think about that a lot. I had really hard conversations, but at the end of the day, when we left, we had made a connection that was, I'm a very touchy-feely person, so it's like a heart-to-heart connection. Even if we didn't agree on the same things, we still knew that we still came to this conclusion that, we're both people, and how can we just respect each other and live together?
Can you talk a little bit about like the dynamic of like how the deep canvassing?
Yeah, like there was a gentleman that we were out in Haw River, again, another rural space, knocking on doors. And I ran into this taller, kind of heavy set gentleman who was white, and approached him. The conversation was about, hey, do you believe that we should have, universal health care? Everybody should get some health care. And he was very much, yes, I have my health issues. I lost my job. I don't have health care. It would be helpful to have that. And the next question was, do you believe that undocumented immigrants should also get universal health care? And that was kind of the two questions, where he was very uneasy about answering that question. He was, in his opinion, felt like, no, undocumented immigrants should not receive universal health care because they were here illegally, and that should, universal health care should be reserved for people who were born here. So then that's where the conversation started, where, I do believe that undocumented immigrants should have universal health care, but that's because my personal experience has been different. Then the conversation just kind of took a turn to, tell me your story about needing help. Have you ever needed help? What's your health care story like? And he started talking about how he worked for a corporate place. He got fired because he hurt his knee, and they wouldn't adjust his working situation. he ended up having a lot of debt, medical bill debt. And so he told me his story. And so, I kind of told him my story. I said, yeah, I have a friend who also has struggled with healthcare. He's got really bad asthma, but doesn't have health insurance, and he pays so much money. He pays $5,000 every time he has to have a treatment. And so we kind of started that conversation of, this is my personal experience, you're sharing your personal experience. And then we came into the undocumented immigrant side. I would share my story about my parents being undocumented and talking about, how it was hard for them just to make ends meet, but they were here to make a better life, and bringing it back to like, what would your family do if you knew you could go across the border and have a better life for your family, which many people did way back in the day. And so by sharing, openly how I was feeling, what I had gone through, he started to think about, well, yeah, actually, I do know somebody who's an undocumented immigrant. It bothers me that he drives to work without a license. I think that's wrong. He needs to follow the rules. But on the other hand, I understand that he needs to provide for his family, and that's the only way he can do it. So he was struggling with this, it's when it comes back down to the cognitive dissonance, where he's struggling with the policies and the laws and the way things should be. And he's coming back to the human side of things, like, well, yeah, this guy's just trying to provide and do the best thing he can for his family. And he's actually a really nice guy. And so by just taking that time to spend 20, 30 minutes with this person on his doorstep, we were able to come back to the question of, if we were to have universal health care, would you include undocumented immigrants? And at the end of the day, he was like, it really changed his mind, because he realized that, undocumented immigrants are here to do the same thing all of us came to do, is just to have a better life.
Yeah, and if I could chime in, this incredible work that Dreama and Shug do kind of on the ground in Alamance, it's not just woo, it's strategic, and I think that our movements for a long time have been really entrenched in our own rhetoric. But if we don't engage with local folks and identify common struggles, and if we give in to dog whistle politics, we're never going to get what we need. We're never going to achieve the wins and the emancipation that we sort of universally desire. And I don't think that there's any need to offer the same grace to people in power or to white supremacists, but I think it's really important that we offer it to our neighbors, just because if we don't, we're failing to recognize these issues as structural and purposeful, and we're refusing to, or we're ignoring the long history in Alamance County of intentional division of people executed by people in power that dates back to like pre-Reconstruction. Sometimes it's hard to explain the importance of these conversations, but in a space like Alamance County or any place that is small towns or rural, folks know each other. Folks are going to have to know each other, and strategically we have to work with people specifically across race. I come from a white working class background. I was raised in almost all white communities, and I've seen the damage and harm of structural racism to my family because of dog whistle politics and folks trying to divide us and all the things that we don't have because we have fed into those narratives. And a lot of the work that like Dreama and Shug and folks in Alamance County are doing is trying to move those aside so that folks like Sheriff Johnson and other people in power can't divide us and pick us off in the ways that they have been.
Dreama, I know that you've been doing a lot of work with the class and race dynamics around the criminal justice system and apparatus in Alamance County. Would you be willing to talk a bit about the work around bail and also challenging racialized and class-based prosecution of folks?
Yeah, so I guess to tell you a little bit about my journey of how I got here. In 2015, I was charged as a result of a supervision error that happened at a child care center that I was managing. I was charged, the employee was charged, and the daycare owner was charged, and kind of thrust into the criminal justice system in a way that I hadn't before. They issued a $40,000 bond, and immediately I began to realize that what that was about was not about my guilt or innocence. It was more about whether I had money or not. And so I was able to get out. My family actually had to take money out of their 401ks because we don't have large bank accounts. And so that's kind of what led me to Down Home. I began to look for organizations that was working on that specific problem, not knowing that it was a nationwide issue. And so it landed me in Down Home in the Stop Criminalizing the Poor working group to tell my story and say, hey, we got to do something. I don't know what we're going to do. And so we were able to do some work and create the Alamance County Bail Fund. Although this system is clearly systemic racism, we know it affects people of color at higher amounts, but I cannot not talk about how it affects people who don't have money. And that's Black people, white people, Indigenous people, Latinx people. Just money is the have and the have-nots. And so I began to tell the story of people that were locked up for as little as $350. People who children had went into the system because they were locked up and couldn't pick them up from daycare. And so all they needed was a little bit of money. to get out. Now they've lost their home, they've lost their job, they've lost their children. And so it just this continued spiral down when it simply was about economics and it was about being poor. We put a name on it here at Down Home. We call it criminalization of the poor, because that's exactly what happens with that situation, with situations like fines and fees, and things like that. Some stories that really stand out for me from the bail fund is the bail fund went to bail out an individual. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, it was a Latinx individual, not that matters, but their family needed that person home so they could pay their rent and do what they needed to do. And they literally had scraped up coins from all the people that they knew, and they had about $300 in coins, and his bail was $700. And so if it weren't for the bail fund, he would not have been able to get out of jail. So those stories, the things that have happened to me, the stories that I continue to see, are the reasons why I do the cash bail reform. And here at Down Home, we were able to bring up the fact that in Alamance County, our bail system had not been reformed since 1995. We started meeting with different actors of the system, like judges, and we even got to speak with the DA. And so we began to meet, and the process of bail reform began to happen. Not without a lawsuit from the ACLU. There were individuals that were in the Alamance County Jail that had to sue for the right for the bail reform to begin and to bring notice that this was happening in Alamance County. So our bail forms back in June or July, I think, was the cash bail system was reformed, and about half of the people that were being detained are no longer being detained there. The numbers are starting to go back up, and we have to figure out what's going on with that. But that kind of led me to the bail reform work. And I'm an abolitionist all the way, but I recognize that Alamance County, that's a new concept for Alamance County. And whereas I believe that cash bail should end, I understand that Alamance County is just that cash bail reform. And so this is where we are.
Yeah, I guess that's the thing about, are we approaching reformist reforms or abolitionist reforms? And has the county, and this is kind of off topic maybe to the work that Down Home has been doing, but has the county modified its incarceration during the COVID pandemic? Like, I know here in Buncombe, our anarchist Black Cross group and some other abolitionists were trying to put pressure on the county jail to release people, and it turned out that they had already, of their own volition, because of, I guess, who the DA is at the moment, decided to cut the non-federal population by half, so 300 people, and change the reasons that they would hold people. They limited it to violent on-person offenses, and not like property issues that they were holding people for on bail.
So I think that here we did have a large group of people that did work on advocating for people on behalf in the jail. But here in Alamance County, first of all, we have a sheriff that, as soon as the mask mandate was put out through our governor, did press conferences saying that he would not enforce the mask mandate. He will not enforce the time period that the governor has put in for us to stay at home. So we, in turn, we did not get people that were released. Thankfully, we did have the bail fund, and we were able to do a mass bailout. But that only occurred after over 100 cases of COVID occurred in Alamance County Jail. We were one of the largest breakouts of a jail, a detention center in the county. And so when we realized that they weren't going to do those kind of release or those mercy release, I mean, they were still arresting people while they were having the outbreak go on in jail. And so when we realized that was not going to happen, the members of the bail fund began to talk. There's some fundraising, and we started helping people get out of there that we could help get out of there, bailing people out. But unfortunately, Alamance County officials have not felt the compassion to offer those releases, or we even talked about things like cite and release, as opposed to arresting people for window breaking crimes, things that are just smaller crimes that could be a citation. So this county didn't participate like we saw some of the other counties actively participate in releasing people.
Yeah, I remember at the beginning of the pandemic how our working group, Stop Criminalizing the Poor working group, worked really diligently to try to get people out. They saw that COVID was going to spread. They wrote numerous letters to lawyers, to judges, to county commissioners, anybody that would listen before this outbreak even happened. And I think it was really frustrating for us because we just couldn't, nobody would listen to us until the outbreak happened. And even then, things didn't really change. But, I'm thankful that, we have so many members that were just willing to be around and bail people out as we could, as we were able to.
I think that what happened in the jail with the COVID outbreak, and as Dreama said, over 100 cases, and we're talking about fairly small jail population, but the lack of ability to get any sort of response from anyone sitting in a seat of power in the local government really exemplifies what's happening in Alamance County and why organizing and protest has become so important. I think that in maybe more urban settings, you get some peace offerings from people in power. And what you think of those is, up to you. But there's just nothing like that in Alamance. And, it's referred to as no chance Alamance. And that's why some of the most important work, in my opinion, that's happening in Alamance County is efforts of mutual aid and the bail fund. We did when COVID started, there was a big effort to just do direct mutual aid to folks because nobody was helping. And the bail fund is definitely a part of that. Is we have a need to get folks out of jail. We have a need to get folks stabilized so that they're able to be taking care of their children, so that we have a need to do eviction defense right now. We have all these needs that are reformist in some capacity, but have to be done in communities like this, because if we don't do this for people, then those people can't be part of movements. All three of us, Dreama, Shug, and I are all moms. We know firsthand that if we don't have the ability to take care of paying our light bill, getting food on the table, then we can't engage in protests or in movement work or to actualize change, because we have to sort of be consumed by those day-to-day needs. And so as much as we can do around mutual aid, which I'm sort of including the bail fund as somewhat of a mutual aid effort, we have to do in order just to stabilize our communities.
I'd be interested, just because it was mentioned earlier, I think it was Gwen, mentioned that this sort of building mutual aid, supporting folks in rural areas at some point felt like it was kind of ceded to the right, and what that has looked like, and how the bail fund and other things like it have been accepted in the community. Is it viewed as some sort of communist effort? Is it viewed as just community members taking care of each other, or something more complex than that?
I think that question depends on who you're asking.
Yeah, for sure.
Organizing is new to Alamance County. So there are people, because this is a new effort and kind of gone against the grain, that see us as a bunch of troublemakers and they really dislike us. But then there are people that really like us because we are troublemakers, but not so much troublemakers, but we're willing to call attention to things that people have not called attention to. Many people have always said, why didn't somebody do something about this? Or why didn't somebody do something? And so I think that a larger part of the community is glad and welcoming to see Down Home being in this community space.
One of the narratives that I see a lot in Alamance County is about insiders and outsiders. And That narrative is incredibly prevalent and strong in Graham in particular, but the county as a whole. And we see that in all the rural communities that we organize in, and it's not a surprise. But the outsider narrative is one of those most commonly used ways to critique movements, and perhaps especially in small towns. And we've seen it all the time. I mean, we saw the outside agitator commentary from both the left and the right this past summer in relation to Minneapolis and Kenosha, Portland. We see it everywhere. And it has a long-standing tradition and racist roots. And in Alamance, if you dare to look at the, comment threads on newspaper articles, et cetera, and even the things that are being said by people who are in power and elected officials, you would think that all these protests were being led by like young white communists from Durham who are traveling in, they're descending in on the communities to cause problems. But we just know that's not true. I mean, Dreama and Shug are both Dreama's lived in Alamance all of her life. Shug has been there and raised her family there. I come in from the outside, and I will also argue that is important. But the narrative is worth looking at because its purpose is to shut down and delegitimize local people's voices. It's not actually there to deconstruct the voices of any outsiders or sympathizers such as myself who are looking in on the situation. During Reconstruction, Republicans and abolitionists were, viewed as carpetbaggers, while many of them were from the South all along. Alamance County had a Red Strings movement, which was absolutely anti-racist and anti-establishment. And we know that there's many whites, and especially poor whites, who were abolitionists during Reconstruction, and they began to see class solidarity with freedmen. And that outsider narrative was used then to disrupt that class solidarity and make the people who are participating in this class solidarity as suspect. And we're seeing the exact same thing happen today. King was accused of being an outside agitator when he went into southern cities like Selma, New Orleans, and Tupelo. And so it's just being repeated again and again. And while outsiders like myself have absolutely taken an interest in the county because we love and care about the people who are there, we are not leading the charge by any means. And that's really important. I think I would call on outsiders to help and look in and show up and pay attention to especially rural communities. But the organizing has to be led by the people who live there, and certainly the people who are raising their families there, because the rest of us get to leave. And that's Down Home's model, is to always defer to local folks. And I think that's a really important thing for places like Alamance.
This is The Final Straw, and you're listening to our conversation with three organizers from DownhomeNC about Alamance County, North Carolina. Earlier it was mentioned the statue, and so that's in the center of Graham, like many other cities in North Carolina and the U.S. South in particular. There are symbols that are there to memorialize the CSA or the Confederacy. Well, just to describe it based on this Intercept article that was written in June by Ada Chavez, it's, the pretty classic Confederate soldier with a rifle standing on a pedestal in the middle of downtown in front of the courthouse and the police department and such. And it was put on the site of the lynching murder of Wyatt Outlaw in 1870, who was Graham's first Blacktown commissioner, killed by the KKK, and the statue was dedicated by the KKK. The way that Alamance made it into my vocabulary was because of neo-Confederates based in Alamance coming out to other events around North Carolina, waving Confederate flags, confronting people, this group called Act Back, and apparently their goal of trying to get as many Confederate flags down 40 and other highways on private property as they could, just to spread the signs of terror. And I know over the last couple of years in Alamance and in Graham in particular, the neo-Confederate strain has been coming into conflict with anti-racists and causing a lot of mayhem, a lot of fights. Can you all talk about how groups like Act Back have been organizing and their relationship to law enforcement?
Yeah, that's the crux of it right there, is the relation to law enforcement. I think if you go into Graham, it's a very classic sort of Southern setting where you have a central courthouse in the middle of town, with sort of a commercial district immediately around it. And this Confederate statue on the north side of the courthouse facing defiantly north, just like so many of them are throughout lots of towns that we are all from. But when you go into Graham, you now additionally have another scene added in, and that is on any given day, not even because there's a mobilization of Black Lives Matter or not because there's like a call to action or a protest scheduled, but just on a given day, you will often find neo-Confederates waving Confederate flags, MAGA flags, standing around that vicinity. And you will find the sheriff's department and frequently Sheriff Johnson himself sort of standing guard at this statue. And the sheriff certainly seems to be inviting conflict. And he also, it is felt, is deeply aligned with sort of the neo-Confederate and the Act Back presence. And so last spring and all through this summer, we have seen Act Back, which was at one point classified as a hate group. I think it was actually removed. And folks from League of the South, which is an absolute white supremacist hate group, there, along with other people. And it's this visceral presence as you move in. And again, it's a daily presence. It's not just counter-protesters. In most of the places where Down Home organizes, we saw counter-protesters show up to Black Lives Matter protests. We saw that in June and July and August in Maggie Valley, North Carolina. We saw that in Sylva, North Carolina. We saw that in Concord, North Carolina, all these small towns. But in Graham, they're always there, or that's at least the feeling. And so it really asks the question of why, since we do have these statues everywhere, and why is it that white supremacists that are overt white supremacists have found such a home in Graham? And I would argue that is has a lot to do with, to be generous, the negligence of local folks in power and law enforcement, or in harsher terms, the absolute welcoming of their presence by people in power and the local law enforcement.
Am I correct in understanding that there was actually a rule on the books in the city that said that public protest without a permit would be illegal and that they weren't going to give permits to anyone? And can you talk about the enforcement of that and if that's still on the books?
Yeah, that was a thing. So Graham already had a controversial protest ordinance that I don't think people really understood. We at Down Home, we had an incident where we'd had some experience with it, but literally if anything above 2x2, you could walk only by 2x2. Any other gathering was considered a protest and required a permit. And so that happened. And then there was a permit required to protest. You couldn't hold a sign or you couldn't hold an amplifying device or use an amplifying device without a permit. And so that was challenged by several in the community. The ACLU was involved, and basically they were told that they had to roll back their permit process and they had to come up with another process that didn't interfere with our First Amendment right. This was all over like land around the statue, which is considered the historic courthouse. We literally couldn't walk on the sidewalk around the courthouse without a permit. After the first time they went to court, they came back out with this free speech zones. So we had actually times and dates and days that you could protest certain hours and be allowed on the sidewalk near the courthouse. And then anything outside of that order and that time was not permitted. Again, people sued, people drew attention to that, and then the free speech zones were gone. So it's just been a continual thing. Now you've got those lawsuits going. Now there's another lawsuit where the press is not allowed in the courtroom. And they understand COVID, but they're not allowing the press in the courtroom. There's been an incident where press are not allowed into county commissioner meetings. So there are lots of First amendment right violations that happen here in Alamance County.
And can you all talk about the march to early voting that happened on Halloween and what happened there? It was a pretty heavy response by police to a nonviolent church-led protest, as far as I understand.
So I've been on the ground since these protests started, watching them develop, watching people lead them, the response from the sheriff's department, the constant surveillance, cops all over the statue, the amounts of money that were being spent on just protecting the statue, sheriff's department being afraid that somebody's going to knock the statue down. And so little by little, it was almost like the Wizard of Oz when the Munchkins start coming out, because people started coming out like wanting to support people that were the few folks that were out there protesting. And little by little, more and more people started coming out. We had that big rally July 11th, I think it was, where we had almost 1,000 people show up. That was executed very pretty much peacefully. There were some issues there, but it was a really great wake up call in a sense, where people were like, oh my gosh, what is happening here? Fast forward to October, but meanwhile on the ground there's all these little protests happening, and being there, watching the police department, you got the sheriff's department and you have the Grand Police Department. And it was an interesting dynamic, because there was almost a conflict between the sheriff and the Grand PD, just from my observation being on the ground. I felt like towards before October, the Graham was being a little more sympathetic to organizers that were on the ground having their rallies. And so fast forward to Halloween, it was really another protest. People were walking peacefully, marching. Everyone was in a good mood. We're coming up through the main street in downtown Graham, heading towards the Confederate Monument. And then the rally stops, and we have a moment of silence, 8 minutes, 46 seconds for George Floyd. After that, we start calling out names of people that couldn't be here to vote because they had been shot and killed by law enforcement. There was going to be another rally. They were going to set up, a stage to let everybody speak who wanted to speak. And I remember hearing, okay, guys, let's socially distance. We're here to have a good time. We're here to support each other. We're here to have fun. Let's just, have a good time while we're setting up the stage. The next thing you know, you hear the Grand PD sheriff. I'm not even sure who it was, but you hear law enforcement yelling, this rally is over. People need to get off the street, and we're being like corralled, like animals to, go to the sidewalks, because we had occupied like the middle street, and so people are confused. They don't know what's happening, and I swear it must have been, I don't even think it was a minute, 2 minutes maybe. We start hearing pepper spray. Like, I felt like the law enforcement, I don't know if they were, the way I could describe it to me from my perspective was that law enforcement was just on like steroids that day. They were not friendly whatsoever. It was just get out of the street, pushing people to their side. And before you knew it, there was pepper spray being sprayed on the ground, hitting little kids that happened to be up in the, up in the front. And I was kind of set back, but even I felt it, being as far back as I was. So yeah, it was just a real intense moment, like that escalated for no reason. And I think every time I'm in Graham and I see these things happening, especially like I said, over the summer, over the fall, like all I can go back and think about is our elected officials and how they find this acceptable, and how, easily they could turn Graham into a friendly place, Alamance County into a community-oriented place by just changing a few things. But yeah, that day was just extremely intense. And again, peaceful protests, and it was so much aggression on the ground from law enforcement.
In a lot of ways, while it's shocking, this is why it made national news, is you have families, I was there with my child, being pepper sprayed in a march to the polls. It's like, how innocuous can one get? And that's why it made national news. But in a way, in Graham, it didn't feel surprising. And well, anyone would agree that it should feel surprising. But if you look sort of back at the history of the sheriff's department and, again, of just folks in power, and the work that we've talked about today about sort of the criminalization of poor folks and the agreements with ICE that the sheriff holds through 287G agreements. And all of these pieces, it ends up not feeling surprising when you see something like this happening. And it feels shocking to sort of a more mediated, moderated outside world. But this is exactly what we see in small towns and small communities. And I would say specifically and particularly with sheriffs. And the other piece to that Graham March that feels important is whenever there is even a small gathering of Black Lives Matter protesters, for example, there is always a neo-Confederate presence in downtown Graham. And one of the noticeable things that day in Graham is that the neo-Confederates who were there, just countless numbers of days over the last 6-7 months, had relocated from the corner where they always stand to another location. And my 13-year-old said, that feels strange to me. He was familiar enough with the layout and sort of how this happens in Graham. And so it felt suspect and strange that the neo-Confederates had moved. And there's a local journalist with Yes Weekly, Ian McDowell, who broke the story about a Confederate live feed. They were streaming on one of their Facebook profiles, I think it was Facebook, where they seemed to acknowledge that the sheriff's department or somebody in law enforcement had asked them to move to a different location. And when the pepper spraying started, the comment from this person live streaming was that they kind of now understood why that they were moved. And so while that's not necessarily a smoking gun of connection between law enforcement and neo-Confederates, it all lends to the feeling and narrative that is viscerally felt in Graham that is maybe particular to that location.
This is The Final Straw, and you're listening to our conversation with 3 organizers from DownhomeNC about Alamance County, North Carolina. Frequently, there are long-standing ties between white supremacist organizers and law enforcement if they're not one and the same.
Yeah, I think that I wouldn't personally maybe just say that they are attached, but there are things that leave things in question of how close they are attached. What happens in Graham, you actually have 2 departments in Graham. You have the Graham Police Department, and then you have the Sheriff's Department, which is because Graham is the center of the county. And so one of the things that we see with our Sheriff's Department is the arrests are done unequally. People who are Confederate sympathizers or counter protesters, the Sheriff's Department does not arrest those people. However, there have been people that have been a part of this movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, that have been arrested for frivolous causes such as failure to disperse, disorderly conduct, cursing in public. We have people who've been arrested at county commissioner meetings. So although we see these things, we can't definitely say yes that the white supremacists are connected to the police departments, but they do things that allow us to see. There's video floating around of the sheriff standing in front of a lady that's literally cursing at another lady, not wearing a mask, and then turn around just a couple days later, someone was arrested for cursing. So these kind of things leave us to wonder if they really do go hand in hand.
Well, not only that, there's been again, because even not having hard evidence, it's still when you're out there and you're seeing these interactions, you're seeing, the sheriff consoling somebody that, for lack of a better word, the person that started to act back, consoling him. Meanwhile, somebody gets arrested, all along the neo-Confeds are, I don't even know what to call them, are ringing this bell, claiming it as their bell. But then if, another black protester went up there, rang the bell, and was arrested. It's like there's no hard evidence, but you see things that happen when you're out there that clearly something's going on.
And it's not just our side that sees that. It's clear that the Act Back, League of the South, neo-Confederate side see it as well. And you can tell that because of their presence. They have a presence in Graham unlike any other place that I know of, currently, at least in North Carolina, where they are very emboldened. And we see that not only in the streets and at protests of just what they're doing, like this bell ringing episode, while that sounds sort of innocuous, what this was there's a huge, I guess it must have been the courthouse bell at one point, but there's an enormous bell at ground level. And the sheriffs will allow the neo-Confederates to ring it literally for hours on end in order to drown out permitted protests that are happening in the street where people are trying to give speeches. And the other thing that the sheriffs will do is they allow folks to be really, really in close proximity, which feels incredibly dangerous sometimes. To the second march that was to complete the original march that was thwarted by all the pepper spray, 2 days after the October 31st march, that was one of the most alarming marches to me, because the sheriffs and the Graham Police Department seem to completely back off from the crowd. There's a large neo-Confederate gathering and left no space. They almost seem to like leave us amongst each other as if they were willing something to happen. And so you get this feeling that the other side certainly sees the permission being given to them. And it also happens online. You know, we have folks being harassed and doxxed constantly in really egregious ways. I think most of us have experienced this. And you just sort of see a permission given that we take notice of, and certainly the other side is taking notice of and running with.
It's been mentioned before, the work that's being done around 287G. Can you talk about what 287G is, what and how you've been working to oppose it and what that's looked like?
Yeah, so from what I understand, what I've learned about 287G, it was part of a warrant service officer program, and it was basically created as another way to like racially profile undocumented immigrants that were living within, our county, but all over. The thing about 287G, it came back, so it was defeated, but then it came back around as it's called the 287G Light New Warrant Service Officer Program. And the problem with that is that generally you would have to have an election. The county commissioners would have to, put it out there. Do we want to accept this? Do we want to have this program within our county? It was signed by Alamance, by the sheriff on January 22nd without telling the public. And so I think that, that's a huge part of the problem, is when our elected officials are doing things behind our backs without letting us know that this is a thing. And so it just allows deputies to ask for citizenship status at traffic stops. It's like an agreement between sheriff's deputies are trained kind of to serve ICE warrants. People are pulled over, ask for their license, they get detained. There's no bond set for them intentionally so that they are sent to Georgia. I think it's Savannah, Georgia, and they have to just sit there and wait. So the sheriff's making money off of this.
One thing that was notable about 287G is that in North Carolina, a lot of sheriffs said that they went on record saying they would not participate in 287G. And of course, that was not our sheriff. He went on to make the agreement with ICE. The other issue is that now 287G is not in place, but we do have officer warrant service, which is a part of 287G. And so how the sheriff's department is keeping part of the funding is that ICE funding, and that requires you to keep bodies in place to get that funding. So we see over-policing of our Latinx communities here in Alamance County, and we have people that are just living in fear, children that are living in fear. Before the pandemic, they literally go to school and come home to parents that were gone.
Yeah, if I can jump in and add, before I came into Down Home, I was teaching second grade, and I think that's something that hit my classroom hard, because I had parents would call me and say, hey, my kid missed the bus. They're not going to be at school today because I'm not, I don't have a driver's license. I can't take them to school. And there are a lot of license checkpoints. And so there was so much fear of getting detained that kids often didn't make it to school in particular, and I can say that from just personal experience, and that really woke me up to the things that were happening around here that were unfair. I think Siembra started a responder program, a verifier program, where if you saw a license point check, you get a text and you go out and check to see if there's indeed a license check, to help spread the word to other people. Hey, avoid this space. They're checking licenses, to avoid people getting detained. But yeah, like as a teacher, that really frustrated me to think that kids couldn't even come to school because their parents wouldn't be able to drive them, because they could get detained. And there were kids and the kids would come to school and they would say, gosh, my uncle was just deported. I hope my parents are still home when I get home. So you read about the stories, but when you work with families that are actually dealing with this, it's just a terrible thing that shouldn't be happening.
A lot of American culture tells us that the way that we can engage in politics or in discourse or in shifting power is an event that's, necessarily state sanctioned, that happens every 2 years or every 4 years. And that's often what I've seen in my life, is that people will show up, they show up and they'll show up every 2 years or every 4 years and mark down some boxes and then go home. And it seems like a lot of the work that y'all are engaged in through Down Home and also in your own lives is based on building momentum towards activity. It doesn't have to be protests, but building momentum towards activity that exists outside of just that go into a box every 2 to 4 years to check some marks. That this like popular power that you're trying to build and this new culture is something that takes day-to-day engagement and like visioning with your neighbors what a new Alamance might look like.
Exactly. Like I think that's where Down Home is different, because we are here to build with the community all year round, for me personally, within the next, again, 10 years, it's like, just, we're here and providing that stability and providing that nurturing environment. For me, that's like my focus, is like why we're here, because otherwise things aren't going to change if you're just having these transactional, moments with the people that live here. Hey, come vote. Instead, we're all about the whole transformational side of it. Like really engage people, really open them up to realize what their power is. And I think for me personally, that's what Down Home did for me, because I was one of those people that were unaffiliated, indifferent. I never voted until I started learning more about local politics and understanding how it works. So that got me more engaged. And so that's what I see out there, is a lot of disengaged people in the community because they're, and a lot of it is just survival, struggling to survive. But that's definitely, I feel like how I would define Down Home, is we're here for the long haul.
And I would just like to add that when you were talking about just those 2 years of votes, one of the things we're also helping the community do is the accountability piece, because politicians also come to our communities every 2 years and don't come back until it's time to get our votes again. So we're trying to work with the community and show them how to hold these people accountable to the platforms that they ran on. Although they may not have been the candidates that we wanted, they are the candidates that we've gotten. And now how do we hold them accountable to us so that they don't just come around every 2 years to get our vote?
All three of you, but for the two remaining, thank you so much for joining for this conversation. Dreama and Shug, where can people find out more information about the work that you're engaged in, and or you personally? I don't know if you have blogs or social media that you want to point people to.
I kept my campaign web address, which was Second Chance Alamance, and I kept my Facebook page, just took it down from Dreama Caldwell for County Commissioner just to Dreama J. Caldwell, so I can continue to post campaigns and information there. So I can be found there, and Instagram and Twitter. DJC4 Alamance is where I can personally be found. And Down Home is also in Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. If you look us up, DownhomeNC and the Alamance County chapter, or DownhomeNC.org.
And we do have Facebook pages for each county, so you can specifically look for Alamance County, Cabarrus, Haywood, Jackson, or Madison.
This is The Final Straw, and I'm Bursa Goodness. This show will later be archived at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and you can email us with questions and suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net or thefinalstrawradio@protonmail.com. If you'd like to use any episode for your project or radio show, feel free to do so. Just send us an email to let us know. If you care to, you can send us letters at The Final Straw Radio, P.O. Box 6004, Asheville, North Carolina, 28816. This show is brought to you by Firestorm Books and Coffee. Located at 610 Haywood Road, Firestorm Books and Coffee is a worker-owned co-op in Asheville specializing in offbeat, underground, and independent literature. You can find a catalog of Firestorm's books and zines, plus a full calendar of events up at their website, firestorm.coop.